24th of July, 1996. It was an ordinary summer afternoon in Bowling Green, Kentucky. 7-year-old Morgan Violi was outside the Colony Apartments playing with a friend who was only 6. Nobody there could have imagined that within a few minutes, Morgan would disappear, and that the man responsible would remain unidentified. What happened that afternoon began with a maroon Chevrolet van. A man got out and approached the 2 children. He tried to grab Morgan's 6-year-old friend first. The little girl managed to escape. Then the man turned toward Morgan. He grabbed her, forced her into the van, and drove away. An adult witness saw what happened and immediately contacted the police. For investigators, the case seemed to begin with one crucial question: who was the man in that van? The witness gave police a description. He was a white male, apparently in his 20s, with brown shoulder-length hair and a thin build. The vehicle was described as a maroon or burgundy Chevrolet van, and the witness remembered part of the license plate. Police created a composite sketch, but a description is only useful if it leads to a person. At first, investigators had no idea who the stranger was. There was, however, another part of Morgan's life that immediately attracted attention. Her parents, Stacy and Glenn Violi, were going through a divorce, and on the very day Morgan disappeared, there had been a custody hearing. Morgan's mother had been awarded custody. Her father had not attended the hearing. Naturally, investigators examined the family. Glenn later said that investigators subjected him to polygraph examinations, and that, for a period of time, they considered him a possible suspect. For Morgan's family, those years were filled with suspicion, grief, and unanswered questions. But there was no evidence establishing that Morgan's father had arranged her disappearance. Eventually, investigators moved away from him, and the investigation returned to the stranger in the van. 2 days after Morgan disappeared, police found the maroon Chevrolet van at a truck stop in Tennessee. It was not just another abandoned vehicle. It was the vehicle investigators believed had been used to take Morgan. The van had been stolen from Dayton, Ohio. Investigators processed it carefully. They collected fibers, hair, and other material that might eventually identify whoever had been inside. And one piece of evidence would become extraordinarily important. A fiber recovered from Morgan's hair was consistent with a fiber from the van's seat. That meant the investigation had something physical. Morgan had been inside that vehicle, but investigators still didn't know who had driven it. Then, almost 3 months after Morgan disappeared, the case took its darkest turn. On October 20th, human remains were discovered in a wooded area near White House, Tennessee. Investigators had to consider the possibility that they had found Morgan. They had. The 7-year-old girl who had disappeared from Bowling Green was dead. The search for a missing child had become a murder investigation. But there was still no killer. Investigators had a witness. They had a vehicle. They had forensic evidence. They had a composite sketch. And yet the man's identity remained unknown. What they didn't know was that somewhere in another state, the man they were looking for had already been involved in a series of crimes. His name was Robert Scott Froberg, and his story had begun long before Morgan disappeared. Earlier in 1996, Froberg had escaped from an Alabama prison work detail. He stole a vehicle and fled. He eventually made his way to Pennsylvania, and there, on May 20th, something happened that would become chillingly important later. Froberg was staying around a children's treehouse. A 7-year-old boy encountered him. According to the federal investigation, Froberg asked the boy to come inside. The boy didn't. Instead, he went home and told his mother. She called police. Froberg ran. Police caught him. He was arrested. At that moment, Froberg was back in custody. If the story had ended there, Morgan's life might have taken a completely different path. But it didn't. On July 16th, just 8 days before Morgan disappeared, Froberg escaped again. He climbed onto the roof of the jail, made his way down and fled. He was once again a fugitive, and now he was moving south. A week later, on July 23rd, a maroon Chevrolet van was stolen in Dayton, Ohio. The location was significant. It was only about half a mile from the home where Froberg's parents lived. There is no evidence that his parents participated in Morgan's kidnapping, but the stolen van would soon become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case, because the following day, that same type of van appeared at the Colony Apartments in Bowling Green, and Morgan disappeared. At the time, investigators had no way of knowing that these events were connected. The van was eventually abandoned in Tennessee. Morgan was found in Tennessee, but the person responsible was gone. And then the case went cold. Years passed. 10 years, 20 years. The evidence remained. So did the unanswered questions. What investigators didn't know was that one tiny piece of evidence had survived inside the old case file, a hair. In 1996, investigators could examine it. They could preserve it, but they couldn't extract enough information from it to identify the person responsible. 30 years later, forensic science had changed. Investigators returned to the old evidence. The FBI laboratory was able to obtain a DNA profile from one of the hairs recovered from the van. The profile was searched through CODIS, and this time, the computer returned something investigators had been waiting for since 1996, a name, Robert Scott Froberg. Suddenly, the old case looked completely different. Investigators went back through Froberg's history. The prison escape, the Pennsylvania incident involving the 7-year-old boy, the second escape, the stolen vehicle, the route south, the timing, and then there was the van. The pieces that had seemed unrelated for decades were beginning to form one timeline, but investigators still needed to hear from Froberg himself. So in February 2026, investigators went to Alabama and interviewed him. He was advised of his rights. He agreed to speak, and during that interview, according to the federal affidavit, Froberg described what happened. He said he had been traveling south after escaping custody. He said he stopped in Bowling Green because he wanted marijuana. He went to the Colony Apartments, and there he saw Morgan and her friend. This revelation changed one of the biggest assumptions surrounding the case. There was no documented secret relationship between Froberg and Morgan's family. He said he simply saw the children. He tried to take Morgan's friend first. She escaped. Then he took Morgan. That meant the answer to one of the biggest questions in the case was also one of the most disturbing. Morgan may not have been chosen because of who she was. She may have been chosen simply because she was there. According to Froberg's statement, Morgan was crying as he drove away. He told her that he was taking her to her father. Eventually, he left the interstate near White House, Tennessee, and according to the affidavit, he took Morgan into a wooded area near a barn. What happened there was the part investigators had been trying to understand for 3 decades. Froberg admitted that he strangled Morgan. He then left her body in the woods. He removed her clothing and later said he disposed of it because he was concerned about DNA evidence. He believed he had removed the evidence that could identify him, but there was something he couldn't remove. A tiny piece of biological evidence had already been preserved, a hair. 30 years later, that hair would lead investigators back to him. On February 26, 2026, federal kidnapping charges were filed against Froberg. For the first time since 1996, Morgan's case had a named defendant. And then came the final chapter. On July 22, 2026, Robert Scott Froberg pleaded guilty to kidnapping, resulting in death. The 30-year mystery was finally solved. But there is one question that investigators cannot answer with certainty. Sometimes the smallest piece of evidence can carry the truth for decades, until someone finally knows how to listen to it.